And hey, welcome back, guys, to another episode of the Starbright podcast. This is episode 22, and I believe we're talking about kink and fiction, written fiction specifically. I mean, I guess we can really talk about, I'm not cutting out all the other things, video games. I guess it's fiction too, right? So it's like any kind of fiction, but as our focus was supposed to be written fiction. I know.
We didn't really discuss a hard and fast
Well,
area of
I
media, but
know
we were
you really
definitely.
want to talk more about Haunting Adelaide. I know.
Oh,
I
it's so
know.
fucking bad.
I don't want to talk about it at all.
We're a little traumatized.
Having to read it's bad enough.
Well, some of us.
We
are
we have a
traumatized.
couple
I'm
of
not traumatized.
really great one-liners we can whip out about our live reactions to hearing it.
I still have had the pleasure of not really having to read it at all, other than having to hear about it through you guys.
I'm sure
Prim can-
avoided it.
Prim can give you a really good live reading. I think that you'd really enjoy it,
Nope.
Will.
Nope.
Yeah,
No, thank you.
we'll tag you next time. You'll love it.
Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah, we'll
thank
add
you.
him to the Council of Perverts tag group in our server.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'll accept the tag. Can't promise I'm going to jump in and listen.
He just wants the Council of Perverts tag.
Again, I wouldn't say no to the tag. Just can't promise I'm going to jump in and listen. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty historically, I think, well known, at least within the community, that fiction generally does not get kink right at all whatsoever. Right? Like I'd argue that maybe the pieces of fiction that get kink right are like the things that are smut specific, not fiction with smut in it, but like stuff that are pure smut, written porn. Written porn gets kink right more often than like fantasy fiction does, generally, I'd say. Unless the purpose is to not get it right, in which case that'll be in that kind of genre of smut.
Yeah, that's satirical though. But let's also remind everyone that there are some really bad pieces of literature that do impact BDSM that really shouldn't have. And we are going to discuss tonight one of those that has actually been a major influence on some aspects of BDSM and why it's problematic. We did touch on this a little bit before we started recording.
It's the
sure.
Battlefield Earth of kink.
Oh.
Kink Scientology.
That's a
Kink
great
Scientology.
Analogy.
Oh my God, that's great.
A great analogy. That's fantastic.
Kink Scientology. That actually nails it, and I think that we should really make some memes about that.
What do you mean? 50 Shades is 100% accurate as to what kink is, right?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. Silk handkerchiefs for everybody.
What's wrong with 50 Shades? Explain it to me like I'm stupid.
Oh, you want me to start? Because I'm really good at pretending you're stupid. Oh God, it's just the fucking worst. It's literally just abuse, and the BDSM that is depicted is not even like really scraping the surface on actual BDSM. It's just cringy and just abuse almost all the way through. I'm sure Kat has. I've not actually read most of it besides excerpts, and everything I have read has been awful. Kat, have you actually read it though?
I have read halfway through 50 Shades Darker. I haven't read anything else. It was a very strange experience. And I think it was when I was in early high school. My sister had lost it. I remember her being like told at one point to hide a like anal plug in her purse or beads. Yeah. And they were going to like this gala or some type of big event, cocktail party type deal, and she was supposed to use them there
Oh
and
God.
didn't, something like that. But that's
You
as far
know,
as my memory
bringing
goes.
anal beads to a cocktail party, I feel like the analogy is really fantastic. Like you couldn't have chosen a better name for that event.
Yeah, it was some fancy dressed up event, and I don't think she ended up using them, and then there was some type of punishment being done after that, but my
Ah.
memory is very hazy when it comes to that one.
See, when 50 Shades was becoming really popular, I remember one of my friends was telling me about it, and this was like early days of me like just learning about BDSM before I like really hopped into the community like head first. And she was like really into it, and we were on our college campus, and I went to high school with her. So I went to this like really repressed Mennonite high school with this girl, and she knocked her purse off the table, and the whole thing started vibrating and jumping around because she had her toys in her purse. And we had a really, really awkward experience of me looking at her as she pulled her 50 Shades of Grey book out of her purse and then had to silence her toy that was vibrating all over the floor of the cafeteria of our major college campus.
She's ready for any point of time she gets
Yeah,
a break.
she was ready, and I was sitting there like, I mean, I'm not gonna shame you, babe, but like, did you really think you were gonna need it during our lunch?
College be stressful. I say as if I've been to college.
I mean, I have literally been in mid conversation with someone wearing a skirt when an active vibrator fell out in a cafeteria, no less. By the well, it was the room that abuts the cafeteria. It was kind of like a hangout, like lounge early
Butts it,
lounge
yeah,
area,
that was the
but
terminology you needed to use there.
yeah, but that's the right terminology. But yeah,
Obviously.
so I like. I mean, I have no problem with secret public play with like toys, remote toys, and
Yeah,
stuff like that. I maybe take precautions so that
yeah,
so that they're not falling out, or
yeah.
being visibly
If your
noticed.
butt plug's falling out on the dance floor, you were probably
Oof.
probably a little
Doing it a little
overzealous.
wrong.
Yeah,
But then that's always been the joke about like people like walking around like conventions with like tails and butt plug tails in, and someone comes up not knowing and like yanks on it.
yeah.
you know,
Life altering experience there.
Ah,
not very pleasant.
Also, like, who's yanking on tails in the first place? Like,
People
that's
at
an
cons.
awful large violation of consent in the first place.
the quote
People at
unquote
cons.
nice
Yeah.
guys
Oh yeah, and
Yeah.
it totally
or
is. You
girls.
should ask if
Or
you want to
The
feel up
same
someone's
guys who
tail.
used to,
You should
the guys
ask.
who used to snap bra straps in high school.
Mm-hmm.
But then I come from the generation where people would glomp you at cons. That was like
Glomp.
no one.
Oh my
People
god.
didn't usually ask if they could glomp you. They were just gonna glomp you.
Yeah.
So
That was
that
something I
was
didn't expect to hear some
yeah.
millennial
Roar
trauma
XD.
about.
I thought it was
Glomping.
cool to hug Pedal
Yeah.
Bear as a preteen.
Oh
That was
god,
my
yeah.
generation. Yeah. It was rough.
Hey, killer. And yeah, it's just people have problems respecting even the basic parts of consent, and especially in regards to being touched. So extending that to like, oh, that tail looks fluffy, I should just pet it rather than ask to pet it. That's like that's pretty common. And as much as that comes up in things like 50 Shades, like I feel it's worse than 50 Shades though, because 50 Shades isn't just about like, oh, this person at a con, touched my tail without asking. It's more like, oh, they touched my tail without asking, and then later on, this guy held me down and raped me, but I enjoyed it, so it was okay. Like, I'd say it's a little bit different generally.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm struggling to find it, but going on this back towards a bit of fiction, there's some wolf shifter books out there that do work with consent really well over that topic, over touching tails, ears, or things like that for any of the pup play crowd and stuff. Like,
mhm.
they do focus on consent pretty well in some of those books, specifically over those. Not necessarily in all regards, but
Yeah,
Things
I
to
mean,
look
I,
at
Fully
I
in the
feel like
surprised.
fridge
there,
of your monster fucker books.
I feel like
Are we
there
surprised that
are.
monster fucker books get consent right, and then books that are like, quote unquote vanilla kink, don't though? You know what I mean? Like
Oh,
it's
yeah, like you're not into monster fucking because you're lightly into BDSM though. So I feel like there's a level of exposure therapy at that point.
Maybe just a
Hey.
little.
I was trying to tie it back in with the tails.
Like, look, if you're writing a book about monster fucking, you've probably bypassed the other like 3 or 4 levels of BDSM it takes to get to the point where you're exposed to monster fucking as a genre.
I have a wide array of experience, and
Yeah.
I'm really good at that.
At this point, you have experienced all of the prior 4 levels to get to that point. But yeah, I think that's probably it. Like the things that become like wildly popular, like 50 Shades and Haunting Adeline, these are things that are palatable and good first steps, quote unquote, good first steps for people who are pretty fucking vanilla but think that they're freaky, that want to get into things. You know, there are people who call being kinky freaky, first of all.
The very common trope with kink and fiction is a power dynamic, just basic. There is some type of boss, some type of employee, something like that. Somebody's down on their luck type deal and they're getting a loan or something like that, and it builds into whatever this relationship is. Not always the greatest portrayal, but it's a good step into what it might be.
It gets like the bare fucking bones right for the most part, and then people are like, oh, this is what kink is, and it's not, because kink is a lot more complex than that. There's a lot more understandings of consent that has to go into these things. And also, let's be very clear, portrayals of kink that do not include consent in their portrayals are not portrayals of kink. They're just portrayals of a power dynamic, oftentimes rape. And I feel like a lot of these books that are quote unquote kinky, where they're not actually talking about the people involved actually consenting, meaningfully consenting, we need to stop considering those kink books. They're not kink books. They have trigger warnings. They're properly trigger warninged, but that doesn't mean that they're kink. If we're talking about kink,
smut or rape porn at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like there's a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, Haunting Adeline's a super kinky book, but if you look at it, there's not even a little bit of consent in there. Like none of that was consensual. So I feel like at least in 50 Shades there is a little bit of consent in there. Like it's definitely not as much as you would like to see, but there is at least a degree of consent in there.
I remember the whole contract thing becoming really big once 50 Shades got super popular. And it's not as simple as a written down contract on what your consent is. And because that's always going to change. So you're kind of rewriting that each time.
Well, there is a basic thing that you can do contractually. Like there is a basic agreement, but that there can be more fluidity scene to scene. But like there should be more than just a basic consent contract too. I feel like contracts are great in certain concepts. We've discussed contracts in this podcast several times. But we have to also remember that there are different elements to every scene, and every element of every scene needs to be consented to. So if your contract doesn't cover every single type of scene or every single type of variable, which it probably doesn't, you will still need to do ample consent and discussion before every single scene you can do.
I mean, it's pretty common in kink that you have the rule that you're not doing anything in the scene that wasn't agreed to beforehand, and if you do want to do something else or add things into it, that's something you would negotiate for the next scene. You don't negotiate during. You don't add things during.
Because
you would do it on the next one.
An unfair power dynamic during the discussion.
And it's and I would say it's different if you have a little bit more leeway for that kind of thing. If you're in a relationship, you know what the other person likes and wants, and maybe you don't mention that, hey, I'm gonna spank you, and call you my beautiful little slut during, but you do it because they're gonna like it anyway. That's a little different if you're in a relationship with someone. Kink, I think there is a difference when you're talking about just doing a scene with someone you're not in a relationship with, because that especially you have to be so clear, and so you can't negotiate during. You can't add during. Whatever you're doing for that scene was negotiated beforehand, and that's what you're doing. I don't care how much you think they're going to like it. I don't care how much you like it. That's not your person to be, deciding that. That's not someone you're in a relationship with. You're not doing that. But the problem is, and I think I've brought this up before, is that a lot of the people that
Is
write the kink fiction that becomes popular aren't themselves in the kink scene. Like the person who wrote 50 Shades, I can't for the
Mhm.
life of me remember their name. Um, but I know, like, it was originally like Twilight fan fiction. I know the writer was not big into kink, and
Yeah.
I'm sure they've received a schooling since there's been a lot of backlash from the scene about 50 Shades. But like, they don't know that. They don't know that. And part of 50 Shades is that it's written as kind of a very much a CNC, non-consensual things are happening to the main character, because that's kind of the point of that story a little bit. But it's just not, it's not known by people that aren't in the scene. And that comes up in a lot of vanilla relationships too. A lot of people aren't as respectful of boundaries, and they don't know how to set them, and they don't know how to talk about them, just in normal relationships. And it's just I wish they would. I wish that was more of a discussed thing, because it would be healthier, and then you wouldn't have something like 50 Shades that is unironically, non-consensual. You know what I mean? And then the author goes, "Oh, it's all about kink, and it's about sex, and it's about all this." And no, it's just bad. It's bad. It's bad
Yes.
kinky fan fiction.
And that's exactly it. Like, we have to make this delineation about what is an accurate portrayal of kink, because we talk about in this podcast a lot. If it's not consensual, if it's not properly consented to, then it is not kink. We need to stop calling things that are like outside of the norm or actual rape kink, because that's not what kink is. Kink is not kink if it is not properly consented to. Just like public kink that is not consented to is not kink anymore. As soon as it's not being consented to and you are forcing this upon spectators who did not consent to this, you're not actually being publicly kinky. You're just violating boundaries and consent. I no longer consider that kink activity. That's just problematic. So when we're
It's
talking about
it's
books,
but it's the same way with everything. Like we're saying this about kink, but it's literally about sexual activity as well. It's about, like, personal space activity. If it's not
Yep.
consented to, it's literally abuse. It's that simple.
yes.
And as it is, we have enough trouble. Well, not we, obviously, but the greater public have enough trouble, like, calling abuse when it clearly is,
Mhm.
because the standard is set by society that consent isn't needed for the most part anywhere. And so
Mhm.
when things like this come out, and it's like, oh, it's kinky, so it's different. You know, then consent isn't considered, because they're like, well, you don't need consent if it's like, kinky and different, and because consent isn't considered in, like, vanilla sex.
Nope.
Yeah.
And
And that
and
that
so,
extends,
like,
that extends
yeah.
even into legal circumstances here in the U.S.
Mhm,
Like
mhm.
like if you're married to someone, and you physically hurt them, and you go to court, someone will just say, "Oh, it was just rough kinky sex. They said they were into it," and courts will throw that right out, because it seems
They don't
fine to
want to deal
us.
with it,
Let's not.
first of all.
Yeah,
Yeah. They don't
and
want to
they
touch
don't want to
it.
touch
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. I
I was
also, one of
able
the things that really bothers me is, especially in media, like memes, are when people are like, oh, well, my favorite girls are girls who don't believe in a wrong hole. Well, if she didn't agree to anal, like, you're just raping her.
Yep.
Full stop. She didn't agree to it. She didn't consent to it. So, yes, there is always a wrong hole. Even if she sometimes likes anal, if she didn't explicitly consent to that in this encounter, you're raping her. So don't come at me with there's no wrong hole. There is. There's consent. You're just a rapist.
I was able to find the contract from 50 Shades.
Oh
Um,
gosh.
Reading through it though, it actually seems pretty reasonable. At least
It's a standard
the
issue one, if
skimming.
I recall.
Yeah, the first fundamental terms, fundamental purpose of the contract is to allow the submissive to explore her sensuality and her limits safely, with due respect and regard for her needs, her limits, and her well-being. The third one, the dominant and the submissive agree and acknowledge that all that occurs under the terms of this contract will be consensual, confidential, and subject to the agreed limits and safety procedures set out in this contract. Additional limits and safety procedures may be agreed in writing. So that already sets out the baseline of consent between the two main characters in that.
Mhm.
And I'm pretty sure this happens before any actual kink happens. They might have had sex before, but I can't remember.
So let's spoil this for people. How much of this do you think actually shows up at Haunting Adeline?
None.
Yep.
Absolutely
So people
none.
ask me why I think Haunting Adeline is a far worse depiction of anything kink related. At least 50 Shades had some degree of consent.
And you can see all of it. I mean, they even use this baseline of a contract for other contracts for people.
Yeah, like it's a standard issue contract. I think the 50 Shades contract probably did actually change some of the like contracting norms within BDSM because we were suddenly seeing such a huge influx of like that standard language of contract.
Mm-hmm.
But if I recall correctly, like I was not ever into 50 Shades. I read excerpts here and there. I've never seen the movies because I intentionally avoid them as much as I physically possibly can. But I did read enough about it, and I know I've seen the contract, and I remember thinking when I saw it, like, you know, if all that was happening was like this contract, I would not even have beef with this book. But that's not all that happened. The contract itself wasn't what I take issue with.
I think it's mainly the writing of 50 Shades that is the issue.
I mean, any book that was based on Twilight was going to be bad. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, the actual core of the kink that it kind of follows is good. It's not the best representation, but
Far from.
mm-hmm. But at least this contract gives a very it details like soft limits, it details consent still from what I'm seeing, and hard limits and no's. And I think in the book, like she actively goes through and writes out things as well that she doesn't agree with in the contract. And I think he rewrites it.
I
I've
have no
never read it, so I
recollection
couldn't
of
tell
any of
you.
this. Yeah. Prim, did you ever read 50 Shades? It seems like something you would have read for the giggles.
No, I've used it in art pieces. But I was going to say, if you want to hear the best version of 50 Shades, Gilbert Gottfried did some reading of it, and hearing him say vagina is like
Oh
literally
my god.
the best thing I've ever heard.
That sounds correct. That sounds
Mhm.
correct.
Personally, that's my
Okay.
favorite thing that has come from 50 Shades.
But the other big thing that I really wanted to talk about was the fucking terrible 1970s book of the Slave Girls of Gore and what it was the precursor of Gory and BDSM, and what a fucking incel fest that is. I am not even going to apologize for this, but Gory and BDSM is literally just incel BDSM. It is the most horrific writing and the most horrific book and the most horrific representation of BDSM I have ever heard or seen. And it somehow became an entire sector and basis of a lot of the slave tropes of BDSM. And slave based BDSM can be excellent, it can be consensual, and it can be very, very safe. But gory and BDSM at its core is not. It's some of the most toxic elements of the old guard BDSM that we often discuss as being problematic on this podcast. And when we were thinking about, you know, literature portrayals of BDSM, this was a big one that stood out to me as one of the most influential yet awful influences of fantasy literature in BDSM. How does everyone else feel?
I mean, just the review that I was reading earlier off
Oh,
of
those
Goodreads,
reviews are great.
none of the ratings are good on it, which is already a bad sign. And that's on multiple sites that I'm seeing. Most of the ratings are right around a 3.
3 out of what?
3 out of 5. But
Okay.
even then, all of the top reviews on it are usually negative reviews that I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Nobody has anything good really to say about it.
No.
Let me find the Goodreads one.
I
No,
imagine that's because the people who consider it good are the ones touting the values, not leaving book reviews.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's just incel BDSM. And when Prim mentioned what did Prim say at the beginning of the
Scientology.
podcast? So yeah, the Scientology of BDSM. I think that's an accurate portrayal of like Scientology and BDSM. It's this awful little subgroup like people acknowledge exists, but nobody really wants to look in the eye. Like the slavery that comes out of Gorian BDSM is often so non-consensual and so hard to justify under the rules of consent that we tout for other forms of of BDSM and kink that I just don't understand how there is still a place for it in modern BDSM. The idea that a slave shouldn't have limits and that the limits should be able to be pushed by a dom, or a good dom should be pushing their limits and teaching them not to have limits, fucking horrifying.
Yeah,
I
and I
think
mean,
that
I'd say that that doesn't have a place in modern kink. You know,
I don't think it does
outside
either.
of some probably pretty twisted people that either think they should want that for themselves or think that they should want that for a submissive. You know, and but those kind of people generally, I'd say, don't go to events, aren't very social about it, and don't talk about it because that is not accepted.
There are elements in media. I feel like we were talking about this previously too, where the old guard is getting old enough now where they've got more spare time and they're posting more on social media. So we're seeing pages and well, not influencers, but like pages, meme makers, and people who are more active in the community, writing literature and quote educational pieces that are touting these ideals from this outdated and frankly horrifying subgroup of BDSM and trying to normalize it as if this is something that should be accepted. And I am firmly of the opinion that this should not be accepted in BDSM, in any modern form of BDSM, because we should be really focusing on consent. And if your idea of consent is that once they consent, they no longer have a say in what I do to them, then no, you are just a rapist. Full
Yep.
stop.
I
So
think
I can't
a
excuse it.
manual written about sci-fi slavery in the 70s is a little bit too close to, you know, black slavery's version of a slave.
Yeah.
And written by white dudes about women in the 70s. How was any good as a standard going to come from that? Why are they holding that up as like the Bible of anything?
Looking through these
And
reviews, since I don't know much about the book itself, evidently the free women of Gore have to cover themselves in burqa-like outfits, and they're not allowed to express their sexuality in any way or even enjoy sex, this one person claims.
Yep.
Not reliable commenter there, but like you can't in a society like that, it's not something that you just flip flop one to the other, especially if you are having an active sex slave trade. That doesn't really make sense to me in a book either.
Oh yeah,
I,
it's basically women, no matter if they're free or not, are just fucking objects, and it's the worst possible basis for somebody to have an idea of sexuality or BDSM, because then you're having this. Well, if this woman is hypersexual, then she's a slave, and if she's not, if she's prudish, or if she's not meaning to be a slave or meaning to be punished or meant to be property, then she should be completely prudish and covered up and not be allowed to express herself sexually whatsoever. But if she is, then that means I can own her. And that's the kind of idea that you see a lot in the really problematic segments of BDSM, where I should be able to own you. You shouldn't be able to resist me. You shouldn't be able to have opinions or disagree with me. And yeah, that's a lot of sexism in and of itself. But like within BDSM, there are segments of BDSM where it is very much like that. That's why some brats are hated so much, because they are not fully submissive and doing exactly what that dominant says with no resistance.
mean,
Resistance is offensive to them.
I'm not gonna lie. I don't know because I'm a massive bibliophile generally. Was not the biggest fan of books that are, you know, fiction, but very like very heavy in the smut, only because they're usually written very cringily. So I happily avoided a lot of this, but I have read a lot of 70s science fiction, and I have to say, it was a wild place. It was a wild time, and Slave Girls of Gore does not even sound all that wild in terms of some of the things that I've read. An author I do happen to enjoy, Robert A. Heinlein, also wrote a whole book on why incest should be totally fine as long as you're not having kids. That's the same time period, late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
So it's not like that was one of the mediums where people were just staying and doing anything that they liked that was repressed from society, and going like, oh no, look, it could be good. Look at this fiction that, extols its virtues. And that was very much like the home front of that at the time. Um, and it I not that we should be looking at that and going like, oh, that's a good idea. We should take that, because definitely not. But that's pretty common. Like, that level of lunacy, I guess I'll say, was pretty common in that genre at the time.
Yeah. But somehow
Yeah.
this like one book became the basis of this whole awful segment of BDSM that still haunts us to this day as being probably one of the least possibly able to be consented to appropriately forms of BDSM that is somehow somewhat mainstream. I don't know any younger people who are currently practicing anything akin to Gorian BDSM, but a lot of the slave poses that we see in modern BDSM, even in like regular, like non-toxic slave dynamics, a lot of those poses are from Gorian BDSM. That's where they establish themselves. And then there's other things like the idea of slave markets being on sale. A lot of that is derived, the way that that's presented is derived from things like Gorian BDSM. Like, a lot of these really core elements that exist in our concept of slavery BDSM are derived from things like Gorian BDSM. And it's so deeply rooted that we have this really toxic ancestry for a lot of it. And a lot of people aren't aware that that's where it came from. But if you look into where a lot of these slave poses developed, a lot of it comes from Gorian BDSM. And it's pretty fucking gross. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it doesn't surprise me because, Scientology is based on an L. Ron Hubbard book from the 70s. So, like,
yeah, basically,
go figure.
Gorian BDSM is the Scientology BDSM. None of us actually want to look it in the eye, but it's kind of there. We have to. Okay.
Speaking of another awful 70s science fiction writer, goddamn L. Ron Hubbard.
Oh my God. Like, that was one that, like, we've made fun of it a couple of times in this podcast, I think, but it is really rooted deep in the heritage of BDSM. And I really hate that for us. I feel like the fact that a lot of the basis of a lot of the really healthy slavery-based dynamics that we have today is still rooted in something that toxic does still bother me.
Well, it doesn't, because, okay, so I've had this discussion before. I don't know ever on this podcast, but there is also a prevailing, it still exists to this day. It's gotten better. Disney's not all about it as they used to be, but there was for about 100 years a period of this thing where, love is about finding your soulmate, and you're going to have one person that's supposed to match you exactly, and they're going to own you totally. You're going to own them totally, and everything is forgivable, and it doesn't matter. Do everything you can to be with your soulmate. Otherwise, you're a lonely person. You're never going to find fulfillment. And every bit of like romance fiction played into that. Every bit of big Disney movies and stories all played into that. Every princess had their prince, and there was always that right person, and they'd always find that right person. And that is the vanilla version of essentially Gorian BDSM, where it forgives everything, and it's pretty much object ownership of another person in a way, and you're treated like you're not a person, you're not good as a person if you haven't found that, or if you're not trying to find that, and if you speak out against it, you're some like crazy outsider that just doesn't know any better kind of thing if you speak out against that. And I feel like we've definitely the kink scene has, outlasted gory and BDSM. We're definitely not about that anymore. And I'd say, especially with how big the sexual positivity movement is nowadays, and how many people are very much more open about it, that we're getting over the vanilla side of that. We're still not there yet, though, because that's we haven't brought the foundations of kink. Communication, honest communication, I should say. Being able to set boundaries, and being knowledgeable and experienced / able to research about sex is not something that's generally talked about on the vanilla side. So we're not there yet. But I'd say they both kind of went together, because they both had this ridiculously, completely fantasized version of relationships, this view of relationships that just is not real. But everyone fucking fed into it. Everyone, and no one knew the difference.
But that's all
And
just societal backed. Like that's
yep,
everything society says. All those things that's what we should be aiming for.
exactly.
And you look at like incel literature as well. Incel words on the internet. It's the same thing. Like, all the best guys get the best women, but every man is like owed a woman.
Yep.
Like, who is totally subservient. Like,
Yes, you should be
it's
entitled
that
to it.
they should get. Yeah, entitlement. Yeah, exactly. I mean, fancy entitlement from men.
Fancy that, honestly. But no, I would say that even though we've grown past it, we still have these elements that exist. And some of the things that continue on are still problematic. Like some of this concept of slaves not being able to have a choice, or not being able to resist, or the idea of limits in a slave being something you have to train out of them. These are all elements that kind of derive not necessarily just from gory and BDSM, but elements of gory and BDSM still thrive to this day. And I hate it. I hate seeing that in this community that we built, that I value, that really values consent. To have these elements there makes people feel deeply unsafe, and I can't blame them. And then we have things like Haunting Adeline, where consent is not even really a fixture of the books, but they are touted as these amazing kink books. But there's nothing kink about it. It's just this concept of a woman who, we've talked about this before, but she is literally like nondescript woman A from every YA fantasy novel ever, where she's the bestest ever, even though she thinks that she's totally just plain, she's girl next door. But like, actually though, she's the bestest ever, and you just don't realize it yet. But yeah, like she is the fantasy object for all of these guys. And they all are fighting over her as an inanimate object who is only resisting in the most basic of levels. And it's really, really bad.
I mean, part of the solution there is that the author really should have gone kinkier, and it should have just been a reverse harem where she's the linchpin. Don't make anyone fight over it at all. But
Unfortunately, she went the opposite way of that
Mm.
completely with the second book, especially, where she's literally getting sex traded, essentially. She's put into the sex trade. Sorry.
I haven't.
Oh.
Any spoilers?
I forgot there was even a second book.
Yeah.
Now you're depressing me.
I'm sorry. I won't put out any more spoilers if you don't want to, but the second
please spoil it, because it's not going to be something I ever want to read.
She gets kidnapped at the end of the book. One. Second book starts. She's immediately being trained, quote unquote, for a sex trade. Put in this nondescript house, kidnapped. There's one woman who's continuing this trauma essentially onto everybody else because she had to go through it. But she's put into this house with a few other girls. All of them have been there for a very long time, and there's one that hasn't left whatsoever. And essentially, they slowly get buyers, but those buyers then have this hunt night, and they kill them like outright. Anybody who fails this, which doesn't make sense to me, even logically in the trade world. It's fucking dark that I had to like think that through. It's a fucked up book. Like,
fucked up
It
in the way
just-
that it's almost comedically bad from the sound of it.
Yeah. It was a train wreck you couldn't fucking look away from. And
Yeah.
it like completely goes into her disconnecting because she is repeatedly getting raped. But now it's just not a guy that she thinks is hot. It's essentially how
Yeah.
it feels.
Oh no,
that it
I'm not
leaves
being
you.
raped by the hot guy anymore.
Yeah.
Oh wait. Is this the hot guy who was, the guy with two colored eyes who was basically like the seventh grader's idea of like an OP James
Don't
Bond?
forget the scar. He's got
The bestest ever at everything. He's the bestest hacker that ever hacked.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Just hearing descriptions of the book just makes me think it's just a more flowerily written version of My Immortal. It's all that comes into my head.
There's no floweriness, not at all.
Well,
It's fucking terrible.
have you ever read My Immortal? Because that's
My Immortal
I-
reads like it's
I
written
bet it
by
is
a
better.
middle schooler. That's the
No.
difference.
Yeah, same. Haunting Adeline is the same. It
so,
feels like it's written by a 10-year-old boy.
Just
Well,
never
okay.
forget the time that we simultaneously said a bird in the hand and three in the bush.
now
Yeah.
not to ruin things for you, but so My Immortal was like the original famous fan fiction. It came out, it was like 2002, 2003, something like that. It was originally posted that like blew up fan fiction and made fan fiction famous. But not in a good way. It was infamous because it's written or well, the stories tell that the original writer was like 13-year-old girl, and it's a Harry Potter fan fiction where it's a self-insert character who wants to make it with Draco Malfoy essentially. But it's written like a 13-year-old girl would write on AOL Instant Messenger back in 2003. And what I mean is that it's basically almost not English. And it's not good. It's not good. It's not. It is
I like to
literally
read
the worst
about it. I
writing
think I
ever.
haven't read it. Yeah.
You should just for the laughs, just at some point you should. But a lot of fan fiction and some money stuff too was started because of the famousness or infamousness of My Immortal back in the day. And you can still find it posted. I think it was originally, I don't remember where it was originally posted. It might have been Wattpad originally, but I think there's still copies of it up there. I think it's been cross-posted to AO3 at this point. But like there are people that have like retold the story of My Immortal only because they're like, oh, the idea of that is good. The writing was just bad. And it's just the whole thing is juvenile and not well written. And Haunting Adelaide just sounds like a more adult, like actually written English version of My Immortal. The more I hear about it, I'm going to be honest.
I think I've
No.
found better representations of kink in fan fiction alone than I have 1 out of like 50 smut books I've read.
Yeah.
You will. A lot of the sites that are specific for smut, that have like smut only stories or mostly smut only stories, stuff like Literotica and AO3, a lot of people there, it's fan fiction stuff, sure, but it's also written by people that are in the scene and actually have learned more about it. It's not vanilla writers writing about it having no idea what they're doing a lot of the time. And it's not everybody. There's bad representations in there too, but like in general, a lot of those are written by people that write that stuff because they're in the lifestyle, and so they think about that stuff, and so they just also happen to be writers, and they're going to write about it too. So it is. There's definitely much better representations. I mean, there's massive novel series that have started on smut websites that have Mother of Learning, which is a time loop fantasy story, started on Literotica, and it has a lot of smut in it, but it's very well written, and it ended up going to Royal Road and then transitioned to being self-published on Amazon, and it's a pretty big series. So like there it's out there. There's much better representations. It's just they're not like, hey, I bought a whole bunch of fake reads to be on the New York Times bestsellers list, kind of vanilla-y, kind of attracting kind of writing like 50 Shades was.
Mm-hmm. Haunting Adeline somehow just has people who genuinely enjoy it, and I find that troubling because it is such a fucking terrible way to depict smut, and it's depicted as if it's actually kink. Like it's written and like kind of sold as if it's actually supposed to be kink, and it's very clearly not kink.
I blame Book Talk for a good amount of all of that.
I was going to say, but Book Talk has the same. It has the same. Not every book talker, but a lot of book talk. It's the same kind of like window viewing, titillating experience of vanilla people looking at books that have anything that's not vanilla and going like, "Ooh, isn't this so titillating? Ooh, isn't this so fun? Ooh, isn't
Book
this so
Talk's the
different?"
reason that I
It-
read it in the first place.
Exactly. And
I
for the
found
most
out
part,
about it
these creators are
through Book
not.
Talk.
They don't have a good view of what kink actually is, and they've pushed a lot of things. I think A Court of Thorn and Roses is also really popular because of Book
Yes.
Talk too, and like it's just
And I have read the first book of that. There was nothing kinky about that.
yeah, but that's not how they view it because they're not kinky themselves. They're very vanilla,
Isn't it
and they're
just
looking
a
at it through a
harem?
window. Yeah, I believe so.
The first book, there isn't even a harem, really. The first book is just a girl who is like being sexually harassed by a bunch of fairies. And that's the story. Like that is
But
the
it
entire first
becomes a
book.
harem eventually, right? If I remember
Yes.
correctly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
basically.
that alone, that's very titillating to someone whose only experience is very vanilla. You know, to them that's incredibly kinky. So that's what Book Talk. That's how they get that view of that. And
Yeah,
it's
and
just none of
that's
it's
how I found
accurate.
out about it. I haven't been doing a whole lot of reading because I haven't had a whole lot of time. Like when I was younger, I read a lot, but as I've gotten older, I just haven't had the time to sit down and read a book. So I decided I'm going to find a book to read, and Book Talk came up, and it was talking about all these awesome books, and everyone was saying these books were awesome, and I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I bought a Court of Thrones or whatever it is, a Court of something and Roses. I don't
Court of
remember.
Thorns and Roses, if I remember
I don't
correctly.
fucking know. I'm gonna do like I do with Pokemon names. Just whatever comes out of my mouth is what the Pokemon's name is. And it's fine. It
It's the
frustrates
worst.
the shit.
A Court of Monsters and Dicks.
Yeah. Prim's kids are ready to fist fight me on site just because of what I call Pokemon.
My kids would fist fight you, honestly. They overhear it and they're just like, who is this bitch?
Yes, they get mad. It's fucking hilarious. His kids are ready to throw hands with me just about what I call
Who cares?
Pokemon.
Digimon's
Anyway.
better anyway.
Anyway, so I bought it and I'm reading it and everyone's like, oh my God, it's so smutty, it's so sexy. And I'm sitting here going, when does it start? Like, when does it get sexy, guys? Like, right now, it's
Yep.
just like my average experience at the grocery store.
Yep.
What's going on? Just regular
I-
old sexual harassment action happening here.
I think you'll find most of the stuff reported by Book Talk as popular and as famous as that ends up making series, they're going to fall between either completely boring, not really kinky, or bad kink. It's just going to be most of the things that are read there. It's not. I mean, it
I
also
don't
has to
even
be like
read-
the stuff that's honestly smutty. You're not going to be able to review very well on something like TikTok. So that's
Yeah.
part of it.
Like, it's not even like I was reading it for the smut. Like, everyone was talking about how good the book was, and I was like, okay, cool. Like, I'll read it. If it looks like a genuinely good book, I love a good fantasy series. I especially love fantasy series that aren't super like in depth, where you have to really think about it. Like, I like a good, easy to read fantasy story. So I was like, sure, I'll hop in on this one. This sounds great. I mean, Chesh in our server asked me about it, and she's like, oh my God, do you love this too? And I was like, it was mid. Like, don't kill me, but I thought it was fucking mid.
Killer Romantic on YouTube says Walmart can be wild. I don't know what kind of
Rude.
experiences he's having in Walmart, or they're having in Walmart, I should say.
If you go into a Walmart, you're not sexually harassed by at least 3 people, then you're not having the experience of Walmart that I have.
Prim, that review that you linked.
Isn't it accurate?
It's so accurate, but what stuck out the most is the comparison to it being Haunting Adelaide being a Wattpad story. And that's how these feel, honestly.
Yeah.
It's
like
Wattpad.
a badly written Wattpad story. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, if I want something of quality, I'm going to archive, evidently.
It's like a Wattpad story if the people who write on Wattpad just dialed it in and wrote whatever was like on their mind.
To be fair, that is a lot of Wattpad stories. I'm not gonna lie.
Exactly, but like if they really dialed it in and didn't even fucking try.
All of the
Like, there
best
was
stuff
no
on
effort.
Wattpad is stuff that's cross-posted from elsewhere, like written on Royal Road but cross-posted to Wattpad, or written on AO3 and cross-posted to Wattpad. It's not even a Wattpad story. It just happens to be posted there too. But like, yeah, it's Wattpad is one of the dark corners of the internet where stories go to die, generally speaking.
Yeah, that sounds correct. But yeah, I've read in my time a lot of really bad books, and sometimes Criminal will be talking about a book that he's read, and suddenly my brain will just like cancel out any book I've read that wasn't good, and I'll suddenly remember as he's explaining it to me that I've read that. It's been a long fucking time, but I have read that, and I just blocked it out of my memory for some reason. And then the more he talks, I'm like, yeah, that's why I blocked it out of my memory. Yeah, that makes sense.
I have amazing taste. What the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah, that's why you tell me about it, because you know how much I love it. Hate it is what you mean.
Yeah.
If I could go through my my AO3 history, I know there's a few good ones back there
Look,
somewhere.
let's put it this way.
Somewhere.
I will give a book a shot, even if I've heard fucking terrible things about it, right? I actually read the entire Twilight series. And the whole time I'm like, well, people like it, so it has to get better, right?
Oh no. Mouse.
I was wrong. It never got better.
Mouse.
I did the due diligence. I read the whole fucking thing, and at the end, I was like, "This is the worst thing I've ever fucking read."
I'm not. I've never read it. I've had the pleasure of never having read it. I've read bad books, and I love watching bad movies. So like, I'm not afraid of it. It's just I've read My Immortal, so that should tell you something.
Yeah,
But like,
yeah, it's
no, that was
on that topic,
so.
People are saying, well, it's a good idea, but like it was badly written. And I kind of feel like there were some things in Twilight that could have actually been good in the hands of a better writer.
Well, I'm not gonna lie. Okay, I'm not gonna lie. At one point, many a year ago, it being the height of the summer and being sitting at home, naked and sweating, trying to survive in the AC with quite literally
Where is this going?
nothing left to do, I did sit down and I watched the entirety of the Twilight movie series because I literally had nothing better to do at the time. It was rough. And I will say, I watched the whole thing. The twist in the end of the final movie was done very good.
That wasn't in the books, though.
I know. I was about to mention that. That's not even in the books. That's the funniest thing.
No.
The best part of that movie series, the only good part of that movie series, really, I'm going to be honest with you, not even in the books.
I agree, actually. That was probably my favorite part of the last book, or the last movie, and it wasn't even in the books.
Because I hear in the movie theaters, people were freaking the fuck out, is what I hear.
I don't know. I never saw it, like, in theaters. I watched it. I think I watched the movies when they came out. It was on Netflix or Amazon Prime or something, and I just happened to watch them. And I was like, okay, I mean, somehow this is actually better than the books, if I'm being honest. You don't hear that very much, but I think the movies were actually better than the book.
I appreciated watching the wedding too, only because 1,000 Years by Christina Perry is like one of my favorite, like really sappy, stupid
the
love songs.
soundtrack kind of slaps. I'll give it that.
It does, yes. But like, yeah, it's still, even as movies, other than that one twist, which was done very well, probably the best version of that twist that I've seen done. I'm not gonna lie, in movies, I don't know that I've seen that done better. It's a low tier fantasy series. Otherwise, like, I don't.
Yeah, it's honestly like there's probably 7 or 8 books that are almost exactly the same out there.
Way more than that. You know how many bad vampire love romance fan fictions I've read in my life? There's a lot. There's too much. Too much.
When I go for a fantasy series, I never go for a fantasy series that has like a romantic basis, because I'm Demi and I actually find most of it fucking cringe. So like that's never what I look for in books. And if I am like reading a book and it happens to have like a really bad romance, I'll cringe and bear it. But that's not what I set out to read for. So I don't usually read books like of that genre because I just try not to. So when I am exposed to it forcibly, I'm usually pretty fucking grumpy about it.
Mm-hmm.
As we're getting towards the end here, I wanted to shout out this author real quick, Christine Feehan. I was listening to them on Audible. I skipped all the way to book 12. Didn't mean to, but it was free. And it didn't really matter where in the series, because it's one of those that switches main characters throughout of it. But it's her Ghost Walker series. and it did have it doesn't advertise itself as a kink book. I don't feel like it does. But it does have some kink elements in this one specifically. And I think it will reflect that in a few of her other books too that I've been seeing. But Spider Game, really good. I've liked it so far. The Audible with it, there's a lot of Cajun accents, so nice. But it reads well. I love the story and the actual kink side of it because it's working through consent for this character, not just on kink things, but pretty much everything for this very sheltered character. Trying not to spoil anything for it because it is a good book. But I think it does a very good job of showing through some of these things with them working through their boundaries.
She has the hots for Gambit, therefore the Cajun accent thing. If anyone needed to
Yeah.
know.
I know. My mom loved Gambit growing up. I saw a lot of Gambit, okay? I'm just gonna leave it at that.
Yeah, I feel like there could be so much better representation. And we as a community, specifically a kink community, we who know better need to do better and not promote these things as kink when they're not kink, and really work on promoting books and media that are really, not necessarily even the best representations, but good representations, and talking about why things like Haunting Adeline are not good representations, or why the Slave Girls of Gore are fucking terrible representations. Like, we should be doing better and actually doing a good job about talking about why these things are or are not good representations. Like, there's a lot of conversation about how, everyone hates 50 Shades now, but nobody really talks about why we hate 50 Shades. Why do we hate it? Why is it such a bad representation? How do we apply that to other forms of media that are around? Like, why aren't we talking about that? I feel like it would behoove all of us to do ourselves a solid and start talking about this more.
I very much agree. I mean, it also comes from, the stance where a lot of it's not like Haunting Adelaide has a lot of specific reviews where they're talking about it on TikTok, because you're limited in time generally on TikTok videos, at least if you want views, and you can't talk directly about a lot of the stuff that goes on in Haunting Adelaide on TikTok because you get banned off the platform. So you just get those vanilla titillating, oh, this book is so dark and different kind of things, and that's all you hear. It's just until I think we're more socially accepting, I guess, of talking about sex and kink, it's hard to fire back at stuff like that
Well,
in a way that
there
is
is
accessible.
actually a surprisingly robust group of kinksters on TikTok. And I know this because that is like half of my feed now.
Well,
Because,
kink talk is a thing. I know that.
yeah, there's a surprisingly robust group of people on Kink Talk, and they do a fairly good job discussing kink related topics. There are like substitution words that they use, but that's pretty intuitive. You can usually work it out without too much issue. But like, I feel like we could use that kind of platform to talk about what the issues are in these books, but people aren't really doing it very much.
I think another big line to draw with books like this is okay for books to be smut, but not every
Yes.
book is kink.
Yes, and we need to be very good about how we advertise that. Like, no, this is not a kink related book. This is a fucking terrible book in the way it portrays kink, because it's not kink. If you enjoy this type of, dark rape-based fantasy, go for it. My blessings, by all means. But let's not talk about this in terms of it being kinky, because it's not.
Well, I think that's very fair to say, yeah.
Like,
So-
I've got no issue with, rape fantasy stuff. Like, far be it from me, because, like, I too, have particular tastes. But you have to really be careful about how you talk about what it is, because what it is not is kink.
I think the term dark romance is overused.
I agree
That's not what
too.
that is either. It's like constant and serial abuse. That's not the
Yeah.
same thing as dark romance.
Yep.
I usually say dark fantasy because it is a fantasy novel and it's dark, but it's not actually romantic because most of this is not romance that's being portrayed.
Yep.
If that's your fantasy, then sure, you can have that fantasy, but let's not pretend that it's romance because that's not it.
So let's. I think that's a good place to cut it. I think we've discussed a lot, and it is about that time. What do you guys want to talk about for the next Oh, actually, now that we're on this topic, next episode or next would be episode, that we will not. We will be skipping. I think I mentioned it last episode too. We will not be here for that. Nice big 2-week vacation starting next week. So I will be camping out and drinking all the drinks and going to all the parties and events and classes and having all the fun. So our next episode will be if I can find my calendar.
I have the date in my calendar. I just forgot to actually pull it up.
It will
The 16th.
be
16th.
yes, the 16th. Yes. So don't miss us on the second. We will not be here, so don't tune in then. But what do you guys want to talk about on the 16th? What's the next episode?
We had something we discussed last week that we were thinking about discussing. I can't
Why
remember
are
what
you
it was.
bringing up things from last week? You know, none of us will remember that.
Look,
That's a wild
let's-
pull.
We weren't
Mouse.
here last week, Mouse.
Look, we were talking about it in our chat. Fucked if I remember though. Look, we literally have to do a what were we saying we were going to talk about this week again post at the beginning of the day every time that we have a podcast because none of us
I just
actually
listened
remember.
the 9:30 comes up. I listen to the end of the last episode to remember what it is. That's what I do every time.
Prim asked me last week, or not last week, last podcast, if I remember. And I was like, I don't know. Somebody's probably going to listen to the end of the podcast to figure it out. And I figured that's what you guys were doing.
That's how I've
I
always
can't
done it.
remember when the podcast starts, so I've got no hope.
No, he did message me, how long do we have until the podcast today? And I was like, oh, we've got 35 minutes. And he had no idea. He hadn't even gotten out of bed.
You poor soul.
I'm in a different time zone though, just so you know, as if the accent doesn't give it away.
Yeah, why would you choose that? That was your own fault.
Yeah.
I mean, living in the future has its perks.
Does it?
No, because it's Australia.
I don't measure everything by feet, at least.
Look, that's his fantasy right there, is having to carry around somebody's foot as a measuring stick.
Why would I measure things in feet?
That'd be pretty funny.
That's the one upside of living in the future.
Just
Not
redo
having backwards measuring systems.
Listen, just because we have fetishes, you don't. Okay, and
Prim was trying
yuck our
to
yum.
tell me. Prim was trying to tell me like how many fluid ounces something held. I'm like, do you actually think Americans measure in fluid ounces, sir? Come on.
You could measure liquid in feet.
works.
I have no fucking idea. Use a regular, sensible measuring fucking standard. Jesus
Yeah,
Christ.
I'm trying to
We
figure out like
refuse.
how can we measure liquids in feet? We're gonna have to theorize this.
You can.
Well, you
I'll
can
pass.
do volume.
Okay.
So you can measure like a foot by foot volume of milk.
Like that would be an interesting
so the-
measuring system for cum.
I failed math.
The next podcast is about measuring liquid amounts. Is that the topic?
Yeah.
Is it?
3 whole feet of cum.
God. I mean horizontally, not
50 Shades
hard.
of White.
If you want me to fill that volume with cum, that's going to be an issue.
Anyway, this is a look at like what our actual conversations outside of the podcast look like. By the way, our chat is a hot mess.
What do you mean?
We're all
nothing wrong
hot
with it?
messes, to be fair.
That's true. It's true. Hot mess is a good descriptor for pretty much all of us.
I mean, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So,
So thank you. That's like the third time we've almost said the exact same thing at the same time today.
sooner or later, we're gonna get it.
Completely synced up. Let's see. What were we talking about? We had a good topic idea last
You
week too.
keep
And then we were
bringing
like,
up the other week. We're not gonna remember.
We need to make like a
trying.
tick list and tick off the things that we actually talk about, so we can have a list to look at.
I 50
Then forget about that also.
Down.
Yes. I was gonna say, like, do you think any of us have enough like ADHD prowess to actually remember that we have a list?
There's a list.
He's suggesting we have a list, and I don't think any of us would remember the list existed.
I mean, but I'll listen to the end of this episode on the 16th, and remember, there's a list.
We'll have to come up with a list, just like I reminded you like 10 minutes for the last podcast to make beacons.
Yep, exactly.
I'm
And this
also
is
out of my
how we
depth
work.
here. I came in like 50 million episodes late, so I actually don't know what you've talked about. I mean, because I definitely did my research and listened to the podcast before I ever came on. I didn't. So
No.
yeah, you guys are gonna have to nut this one out. Yeah, nut, because I have no fucking idea.
I mean, we can talk about it in the group chat later too. Like, I don't think we have to come up with one this
Oh
instant.
yeah, we could surprise people. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
leave the listeners hanging. Cliffhanger.
On the 16th, our next topic will be, haha, it'll be a surprise. Fuck you. You don't know. We'll find out then. So I hope you guys have
All
enjoyed
surprises are just
listening
And we leave-
and
motherfuckers.
watching.
And we leave you on the note of, measuring common feet. Good luck.
Exactly. If you'd enjoyed what you've been consuming, leave a like, subscribe, follow, whatever the hell it is on wherever you're watching it. And, come hang out with us. There's links everywhere to different social media and Discord and all kinds of different things. And yeah, we'll see you guys next time. Have a good one.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, guys.